So, in 1897, a scandalous proposition was published by novelist and critic Samuel Butler. You see, just a few years earlier, in 1891, Butler was rereading the Odyssey in the original Greek to refresh his memory whilst working on his musical composition Ulysses, and there he was struck with an epiphany. There has always been speculation that the Iliad and the Odyssey were companion pieces and not written by the same person, but Butler went further. He believed that the Odyssey wasn't written by Homer or a man at all, but a brilliant, high-spirited Sicilian girl who wrote herself into the actual text in the form of Princess Nausicaa. Butler presented his theory in a lecture at the Somerville Club in 1893, where he insisted that the real obstacle to a general belief that a woman wrote the Odyssey is not anything that can be found in the poem itself, but the long prevalence of an opinion that the Odyssey was written by the same person who wrote the Iliad. If people would read the poem slowly, intelligently, and without commentary, forgetting all past criticism until they have looked at the matter with their own eyes, I cannot think that they would have much doubt that they were reading a woman's masterpiece, not a man's. But before you get all excited, this isn't some kind of feminist win by any means. You know, part of Butler's argument for why the Odyssey was written by a woman is that axe handles are described incorrectly in the Odyssey. Of course, us women don't know how to use an axe. Actually, I don't. Butler then went on to publish an extended version of his argument in the book, The Authoress of the Odyssey, which was widely dismissed by scholars. The only people who seemed to quite enjoy the premise were J.B. Shaw and Robert Graves, the latter of whom wrote a novella inspired by it called Homer's Daughter. But whether the Iliad and the Odyssey were written by the same person is a separate discussion for another time, though the short answer is no, they were most likely written by different people. It's still, no one really knows, but that's where the census lies. However, what I would like to discuss today is the myth surrounding Homer the poet, the figure of. You know, people know the name, but not very much else about the figure. And there is a plethora of myths surrounding them, from their gender, clearly, to their very existence. You know, much like Shakespeare discussions today, many people don't even believe Homer was a singular person at all, but rather a group of people. Or, actually, Homer is a name for a collective cultural consciousness of the ancient world. But hello there, and welcome to my library. If you're new here, my name is Chinsia, and if you're one of my lovely regulars, hi, how are you? We're obviously covering ancient history today. On Tuesdays, I cover ancient history and classics. My dog joins in now and then for commentary, and let's get into Homer. So where do we start? Well, because I just opened the video with the discussion of Butler's claim that the Odyssey was written by a woman, a claim which has in turn turned into theorizations that Homer was a woman, let's take a deeper look at this argument in particular. So, was Homer a woman? Well, Butler's arguments as to why the Odyssey was clearly written by a woman isn't rooted in archaeological evidence, but rather literary analysis which relies heavily on conformist notions of gender and gender roles. Butler claims that the poetic focus on matters such as housework, dress, cleanliness, obedient and strong women, from Nausicaa's concern for female purity to Penelope's unwavering loyalty, and the sanctification of marriage are indicative of a moral female mindset. Hence why a woman must have written it. To Butler, conscious artistry was feminine, and the Odyssey was a kind of art for art's sake, love of a small lie, and a determination to have things both ways whether it suits her purpose. She loves flimsy disguises and mystifications that mystify nobody. Butler went so far as to say that the elevation of women in the Odyssey through beauty and power was indicative of the self-elevation of a dowdy woman. I think it highly probable that the writer of the Odyssey was both short and plain, and was laughing at herself and intending to make her audience laugh also by describing herself as tall and beautiful. She may have been plain or beautiful without its affecting the argument. Well, at least I know as a plain, short woman I have the ability to write an epic poem that will last centuries, but okay. Thanks, Butler. Butler's rewriting of antiquity was founded on little more than an illusion of a voice and contemporary preconceptions of female interests, rather than an analysis of what ancient women were writing about, or the historical and archaeological lineage of a man called Homer and his works. So regardless of how accurate ancient conceptions of Homer are, there's no ancient notion of the poem being written by a woman. Saying Calypso's jealousy of Penelope is too prettily done for a man would be sure to overdo it, doesn't constitute as sufficient evidence to support an argument that the poem was written by a woman. Again, the argument relies on preconceived, contemporary, conformist standards of masculinity, femininity, and sexuality. What if the author was just very much in tune with his femininity? Or gay? What if the author was writing specifically for a female audience? Or, the biggest hot take of all, what if he just wrote what was organic and natural to them? What if he wanted to reflect the females in his life in the poetry? And don't get me wrong, I am all for offending academic orthodoxy. But if we're forwarding this thesis to that extreme, we need to have more evidence than literary analysis. However, there's no denying that Butler's book played a huge role in literary tradition. As Alison Booth put it, Butler extended the scope for creative criticism by developing a hybrid form of historical travesty, fictive scholarship, and the narrator as biographer cum detective. Butler's response to the hermeneutic revision of the classics, a novelistic rendering of the Odyssey, illustrates a diachronic distortion of what is so dear to hermeneutics today. So now we've discussed the idea that Homer was potentially a woman. What did the ancients think they knew about Homer? Well, for starters, let's look at how they dated Homer. They, like us, had no reliable means of determining when Homer's works were written. So let's look at Homer in the context of the Iliad. So some ancients believed that Homer was a man who witnessed the Trojan War itself, despite the poem taking on a tense which implies the heroes are of a distant era, far removed from that in which the poet is writing. There were then others who believed that, based on Homer's lack of references to the return of the Heraclids and the Ionian migrations, that Homer was writing after the Trojan War, but before these events. So for those unfamiliar, let's discuss these events. The return of the Heraclids, i.e. the descendants of Heracles, is a Greek legend about how the Dorians took possession of the Peloponnesus around 80 years after the Trojan War. But the return of the Heraclids is more commonly known today as the Dorian invasion. The Ionian migrations, on the other hand, was a large-scale migration from mainland Greece to Ionia, which is believed to have occurred at roughly the same time as the Aeolian migration during the 12th, 11th and 10th centuries BCE. Now, both of these migrations are tangled in fiction, folklore, ancient politics, and contemporary academic contentions. So it would be far too much for me to explore these migrations in this video, but the main takeaway to remember here is that both the Aeolian and the Ionian migrations were crucial in establishing a tradition involving movement from mainland Greece to northwestern Asia Minor, just after the Trojan War, albeit with variations in time, routes of passage, and the cast of characters. So in his book, The Making of the Iliad, M.L. West argues that the evidence we have suggests the Iliad was composed over an extended period of time during the 7th century BCE, possibly between 680 and 640 BCE, and Homer would have been born around 700 BCE, give or take a decade. So this assumption is based on several factors, such as how several passages of the Iliad appear to show knowledge of Hesiod's theogony and Hesiod's work and days, and the martial elegy practiced by poets such as Callinus and Tyrtaeus, who were active around the middle of the 7th century. Hesiod is a tricky person to date as well, but West dates him between 730 and 690 BCE, on the grounds that the Amphidamas, at whose funeral games Hesiod won a prize in Chalcis on the island of Evea, is connected by Plutarch with the Lelantine War, a conflict between Chalcis and Everetea that possibly took place in the last third of the 8th century and is dated circa 720 to 680 BCE. So then we have a second battle about Homer. Where was he from? Throughout antiquity, many cities have fought over for the honour of being the birthplace of Homer, with Smyrna being the oldest claimant. Now, Smyrna claims Homer because, in many accounts, Homer isn't Homer's original name. Now, Homer's original name, I don't pronounce correctly. Putting it on the record, I have no idea how to say this name. I spent hours trying to look up how to say this name, so I'm going to butcher it. But for now, I'm going to mispronounce it as Melissagenes. So Homer's original name was apparently Melissagenes, which means born of Meles, and the river Meles flowed by the ancient city of Smyrna. There we go. So that's why they think he's from Smyrna. So if his original name was Melissagenes, where did the name Homer come from? Well, according to some ancient sources, the name Homer was adopted when Melissagenes became blind. Homeros, translated, means hostage, or in this case, he who is forced to follow. And it is believed that the etymology of the name Homer derives from the Lesbic dialect, also known as the Aeolic, for the word blind, Homeroi. Now, there are a few ancient accounts for how Homer apparently lost his sight, but one of the most detailed is found in the Pseudo-Herodotean Vita. Now, for those unfamiliar, the life of Homer is an ancient biography written by the one that we call Pseudo-Herodotus, because they claim that they're Herodotus in the works, and they present themselves as Herodotus, but ancient historians who are very familiar with Herodotus don't believe this person is Herodotus, hence why he's called Pseudo-Herodotus. Nice try, cloud chaser. Anyway, according to Pseudo-Herodotus, Homer became blind when he was returning home from his Mediterranean travels via Ithaca, and it was on Ithaca where his eyes became diseased. As meant to sail back from Leucos, he brought his ship in at Ithaca and picked up Melissagenes, for God's sake that name, and for some time he sailed around with him. And when he arrived on Colophon, it happened that Homer's eye disease came back, and he was unable to escape the disease, but became blind there. And from Colophon, Homer, as a blind man, arrived at Smyrna, and in his condition took up poetry. In their paper on blindness and literacy in Homer, BEECROFT stresses that Pseudo-Herodotus thought it was very important that Homer was well-travelled and literate, because the markings of blindness served as a useful device for dividing Homer's life into the literate, sighted and well-travelled phase, and his blind, non-literate phase of poetic composition. On the other hand, we have a contesting information from another ancient Pseudo-Plutarch I. In his work, The Lives, Pseudo-Plutarch collates sources about Homer, but none of them mention his blindness, and in some cases suggests the opposite. For example, one of the sources Pseudo-Plutarch I uses is a Colophonian tradition represented by an epigram from a statue of Homer said to have been located there. The epigram not only claims Homer as a Colophonian, but that he was a poet who physically wrote his work. O son of Meles, Homer, you gave Kleos to all of Greece, and to Colophon, your homeland of all ages. And these maidens you fathered in your godlike soul, twins from your breast, by writing your pages. One of them hymns the far-wandering nostros of Odysseus, and the other the Iliac War of the Dardanians. You see, back then, blindness was incompatible with literacy, and so in this case, we have a Homeric biographer strategically deploying the evidence he offers about Homer's blindness to reinforce his claims about Homer's textual composition of the Odyssey and the Iliad. However, for me, the most interesting story about how Homer lost his sight appears in the Lives of Homer 7, Anonymous 1, Vita Romana, which reads, he was called, this fucking name, Melissagenes, or Melissagoras from birth. But later he was spoken of as Homer in the lesbian dialect on account of what happened to his eyesight, for they call the blind Homeroi. Or it was because as a boy he was given to the great king as a Homeron, which means security. They say his blindness came about this way. He went to the tomb of Achilles and prayed that he might behold the hero as he was when he went out to join the battle, arrayed in replacement armour. When Achilles appeared to him, Homer was blinded by the dazzle of the armour. But Thetis and the Muses took pity on him and honoured him with the gift of poetry. Others, however, say he suffered this disability as a result of the wrath of Helen, who is angry with him because he said she had deserted her former husband and gone with Alexander. So at any rate, Ellipsis says, that the soul of the heroine actually appeared standing before him in the night, advising him to burn his poems, as he would be okay if he did, but he could not bear to do it. This myth of how Homer lost his sight plays into many traditional mythic structures, particularly divine punishment and blessing, and the most poignant correlation is that of the Tiresias myth. In the Tiresias myth, Hera blinded Tiresias for telling Zeus that, having experienced sex both as a man and a woman, women have higher sexual fulfillment and pleasure than men. I would like to know who Tiresias was having sex with to get that conclusion. After Tiresias was blinded by Hera, Zeus granted him ocular powers, and rather than everyday vision, Tiresias was blessed with prophetic powers. like Tiresias, Homer is pitied upon by the gods for his genuine love of Achilles, so they gave him the skill to express that love through poetry. With all that being said, was Homer even real? Was he a singular person, or were the poems a collective project written by many under a singular name? So Milman Parry was an American classicist who revolutionized Homeric studies at the beginning of the 20th century. Parry explored the formulaic language of epic and demonstrated its systemic character, its extension, and economy. Parry highlighted the repetitive formulaic expressions across the poems, such as Divine Odysseus and Swift-footed Achilles. Parry's argued that these repetitions were not accidental. Rather, they were memory devices that allowed the reciting bard to improvise during his public recitations. Parry argued that the works of Homer were part of a long literary tradition and inferred that the epic poems could not have been the creation of a singular man. Rather, he argued that they were a product of long tradition of oral poetry. However, as West argues, there is a danger in characterizing Homer's works as a result of years of oral poetry, because oralists sometimes give the impression that much of the poem is the product of improvisation, and these epics are far too detailed and structured to be the product of casual improvisation. As West highlights in his book, the writer or writers draws upon a rich oral tradition. They were a master craftsman who built up their epic with great skill and control and employed strategic design strategies within the text. You can't get that kind of structure with several years of improvisation. This is a thorough piece of work. In other words, it's too reductive and simplistic to categorize the poems as mere oral dictated texts. And with this in mind, West's research concludes that the Iliad was written by a single author, but that single author did not author the Odyssey. In fact, West goes so far as to say that neither author was called Homer. So West actually refers to the author of the Iliad as P and the author of the Odyssey as P odd. So in this argument, according to West, the poems weren't written by teams of people, but they were written by multiple people, just two, P and P odd. And P odd wrote their poem with the intention of emulating the exceptional dimensions of P's Iliad, hence why they are structurally very similar, but there's a lot of differences in between. So how did the two actually get lumped together as one poet? Well, when we look at the basics of tradition, the special association of Homer's nature with the Iliad and the Odyssey is bound up with Hipparchus's initiative in establishing regular recitations of these two epics at the Great Panathenea from, most likely, 522 BCE. See, the Iliad and the Odyssey at the time were clearly recognised as two very important works, but before that date, we cannot trace the belief that both poems were authored by a man called Homer. West explains that from the time of their composition, there is a gap of a century or a century and a half, during which we have no evidence at all as to whether the Iliad and the Odyssey were associated with each other, or who, if anyone, was regarded as their author. It may well be that epic poems in the 7th century were in principle anonymous, with the singers not thinking of themselves as authors, but as performers and embellishers of inherited material. And so ends this wee little video on who was Homer, who wrote the Odyssey, and debunking, or rather elaborating on the myths that are around Homer. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching it. If you would like to consider subscribing to my channel, I am intending, if I get them written fast enough, to do history and classical videos on Tuesdays and writing and bookish videos on Thursday. I'd like to say a huge thank you to everyone who subscribed in December and for everyone who gave me video title suggestions for my future videos. I love to hear them in the comments down below. And more importantly, I'd like to thank my patrons for sponsoring this video and making this content possible. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you on Thursday for a bookish video and next Tuesday for another classics and ancient history video. So be happy and healthy, and remember, books save lives, so keep reading.